the boat didn't show up to pick me up. And my battle station was Talker on the 5-inch forward. Now back in those days, a ship that old, it was something around 1923, it was christened, I think. Where the heck was I going with that? I don't know. At any rate, I was Talker on the 5-inch, and the 5 inches wouldn't elevate. They would elevate for battle, for a sea battle, but they wouldn't elevate for aircraft. And so I was standing there waiting for something to happen. And when the second wave came in, they strafed the ship. And I can remember standing there, looking out, and watching this plane come in, which was awfully slow, because it seemed to take about an hour for the bullets to hit the deck going up, and I could see every one of them coming, and I couldn't move. I was just scared to death. And eventually, I got there, I could see this heat deck bouncing up. And eventually it got to me, and I got hit 26 times. Fortunately, on both sides, not in the middle. I was taken a trip, later on taken to Tripler Army Hospital, where they kept me for 4 days, and then threw me out because they had people who were seriously injured. That was my first Pearl Harbor, or first Purple Heart. It was a hard way of getting it, I think. Pearl, from where we were sitting at Westlock, was, oops, oh, that'll help. I guess it will. From Westlock, we couldn't tell what was going on when the first wave hit. We could see the planes, but we couldn't see the insignia on the planes. So we didn't know what was going on. It wasn't until the second wave hit that they found us over at the ammunition dock. I might tell you that the ammunition dock in those days was one of the most beautiful places in Pearl you'll ever see. The trees grew right down to the dock, and when we were tied up there, they probably couldn't see us in there. So they dropped one bomb to hit the dock, and that was all, other than the strafing. After that, I don't know what was going on because I wasn't very much interested in finding out. Going on, we went down on the Tangier, which is where I've been transferred, went down to Guadalcanal. The first Marines had just taken, quote unquote, the island. They hadn't really secured it. It was just before they turned it over to the Army. And they wanted to get the electrical system working for the airfield. And as an electrician mate, I was put over on the beach to get the electrical system working, which was fine. They armed us with a .45 and a Springfield 30-06. I wasn't very impressed with that. I didn't know what I was going to shoot at, but I wasn't impressed. So I glommed onto a BAR. And I stole every clip I could find. I was doing very nicely there. I was young and I didn't have good sense. But in my foxhole, I had found a case of grenades, fragmentation grenades, and I dug little holes in the foxhole around the edges, and I put a grenade in each one so that I could cover the whole area, wasn't any problem. I got to think later if anybody had ever dropped a grenade in there, I'd still be going up. But it didn't occur to me. Every evening, we would hear "Banzai" yelled, and everybody opened fire. We didn't know what we were shooting at. We were having ourselves a real time. And that's where I picked up my second Purple Heart. I I didn't have sense enough to stay out of the way. But I also picked up a silver star in there because, again, I didn't have sense enough to stay out of the way. Later on, I was transferred to the USS Chicago, Heavy Cruiser. That didn't last very long. I think I took my luck with it because it was sunk at the Battle of RAMA. And I was a talker on the bridge those days. It went down, the bridge was afloat. That was the only thing that was afloat. Everything was down because the back had been broken of the ship. I stepped off into the water and I swam over to the beach, which was fine, except it was full of Japanese. And there were several of us behind some rocks in the water. We were behind some rocks. And the Japanese were shooting the dickens out of us, or trying to, but they couldn't get us, which was fortunate. A destroyer came up along about that time and opened fire, and we were rescued, which was fine. I had, someplace along the line, I decided that I was bad at the Japanese. I hadn't gotten into the Navy to have a war. That wasn't what I went in for. I went in together with my father. But I have to digress and tell you that my father had been in World War I and was the chief warrant officer. He had spent 10 or 11 years in the Asiatic fleet. And back in those days, you got double time. You got credit for 2 years for every year you spent in the Asiatic fleet. And so he retired. He retired as the chief warrant officer. Now, for those of you who know, a chief warrant officer is the next thing to God. Believe it or not. And back in those days, there were only 2 grades. There was a warrant and a chief warrant. My father was chief warrant. He retired. He spent most of his time aboard the New Mexico. And that was fine. I came back to the States. I had applied for a commission. I was bad enough on the whole thing that I wanted to get out of this war. And I was commissioned in San Francisco. Now, at that point, I was an officer of the United States Navy, and I had a piece of gold on my arm that proved it. I was really something. And I went over to the beach in San Francisco. I went into a bar. I'd never had a drink in my life. I had 2 beers. And I came out of that bar with my coat unbuttoned, my hat in the back of my head, and my tie askew. And I walked into the arms of Shore Patrol, who were right outside. They picked me up for conduct unbecoming. I don't know why. I thought I was in pretty good shape. They took me down to Shore Patrol headquarters, which in those days was down on Lower Market Street. Since I was an officer, they took me to the duty officer. The duty officer turned out to be my father. You have to understand, I was 20 years old and I was an officer. And so I said to him, "You have to say sir to me because I outrank you." He didn't say anything, just stared at me. I didn't think it hurt me, so I repeated myself. And with that, he just did this. They took me back and locked me in a cell. I stayed there until he got off watch. He came back and got me. But by that time, I'd come to the conclusion that I was pretty dumb because an ensign didn't outrank even an admiral's cat, you know. They used to call it chief warrant. Someplace along in that line, I was sent to flight school in Pensacola, and I did pretty good on basic. And then they moved me to multi-engines. My first check flight in a multi-engine, I landed 40 feet off the deck.